All right, good. Good morning. Good morning on this third Sunday of the Easter season. And we are gathering here today in the Ruth and D.G. Harwood Springmore Sunday School class. I don't think I've ever made the point that my name is Tom Jackson, and I'm a resident here. I'm also a pastor emeritus of the Wake Forest Baptist Church. Today, we're going to read a passage of scripture from Luke's Gospel, and it's one of the various resurrection stories that are found in the Gospels. All four Gospels give us a resurrection story, but they're not the same story. Each Gospel has its own way of telling about what happened when Jesus came out of the tomb and met with his disciples and other people. Only Luke tells this particular story about two men who were walking one day out of the city of Jerusalem on their way to a village called Emmaus. Emmaus has no particular significance in the Bible except for this story. But this story does have significance. Now, when we read this story, you will find that there's something strange about it. It has certain aspects that just don't ring true to reality. For example, these two men have walked away from Jerusalem on the same day that Jesus appeared after his crucifixion, that is on Sunday. They know about the crucifixions that happened back on Friday. They talk about them. But Jesus meets them as they are walking along, and they don't recognize him. After a time, he starts to tell them how the Bible bears witness to him. He gave them a quick resume of the biblical story that culminates with the Messiah, with him. And it was a little while later, the day was getting along, and they decided that it was time for them to stay somewhere along the way. And they invited him to be where they were going to stay, and he accepted that. And then suddenly, Luke says, he took bread at the table. He took bread, he broke it and blessed it, and then their eyes were opened, and they could see that it was Jesus. And there's more still, but that's the heart of the story. So I call it a journey of discovery, because here were two men who knew about Jesus, but they didn't really know Jesus. They couldn't even recognize him when they talked with him. It was only later. The story has levels of meaning, and in fact, as I said a moment ago, it's not quite a straightforward narrative. It's actually a parable. Luke doesn't tell us it's a parable, but it is a meaningful story, a symbolic story, and it has levels of meaning that an ordinary story would not have. So let's read this interesting story. Now that same day, that is the day that Jesus appeared to the women at the tomb and some of his disciples. Now that same day, two of them, that is, two people, were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. That is a full day's journey by foot. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. They had seen several crucifixions. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downward. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" Jesus asked, "What things?" "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel, that is, set Israel free from Rome's domination. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place." He's telling them. "In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive," that is, Jesus. "Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus." Jesus then said, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he, Jesus, explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together. and said, "It is true, the Lord has risen and appeared to us and to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. I suppose now and then you and I have come from our homes in the morning without any particular plans, and before the day was over, we were surprised by something we had not planned for. I suppose it was something like that for these two men. That day they had left wherever they were staying in Jerusalem, deciding to take a walk, not just around the corner, but 9 miles from where they were. So it was a full day's walk. We don't know why they were going to Emmaus, and they didn't know what was going to happen to them along the way. They were talking about the events that had occurred on Good Friday. Of course, they didn't call it Good Friday, but on Friday past, there had been at least 3 crucifixions, maybe more. But they were especially interested in the one that involved a man that some people believe was the Messiah. So while they were talking and discussing what they had seen, Jesus came and joined them and walked with them, and they didn't recognize him. So it turned out to be quite a surprise for them as he started to give them a quick lesson in the Bible, making the point that the prophets, starting with Moses, the servants of God that we call prophets, had been talking about the fact that someday God would send his Messiah to deliver his people from bondage, from their servitude to the Roman Empire. Jesus then told them that that story really had to do with him. But it was only when they got to another place where they were going to spend the evening, and Jesus broke bread with them, and in the breaking of the bread and praying over it, their eyes were opened. Now, this story is not just a straightforward narrative. It's a parable. A parable is a story that has meaning over and above the details. A parable was Jesus' personal way of teaching, his preferred way. So we have numerous parables in the Gospels. And I say this is a parable because there are aspects of this story that don't ring true in terms of reality, because they had listened to Jesus as he recited the biblical story and was trying to make them understand that he was the one that that story pointed to. It was only later when they sat down at table and he broke bread and gave a prayer, only then their eyes were opened. So this is not a true-to-life story. It is a story to excite the imagination of anybody who hears it. Jesus told parables like the parable of the Good Samaritan, for example, or the story of the prodigal son. These were stories that Jesus created for the purpose of making a point. My father some of you heard me say, my father was not an educated person. And he was one of those people who believed everything that he read in the Bible because he trusted that every word in the Bible was the Word of God. And I tried to explain to him that some stories in the Bible are really not to be taken that way because they are stories that were created for the purpose of making a point for their listeners, and that Jesus did that. He told stories. I mentioned to my father one time the story of the Good Samaritan. And I said to my father, now, that's not something that you could have read about in the Jerusalem Post, for example, if you were living then. And my father said, what are you telling me? I said, that's a story that Jesus created about the fact that a man walked down that dangerous road one day. He was accosted by some thieves or bandits along the way who knocked him down. They took his money, left him there for dead. A priest came along, a Levite came along. Both of those men worked at the temple, and they were respected as religious people. But they walked around this man, thinking maybe he was a corpse. And then a Samaritan came. Now, Samaritans were despised in that Jewish community. And he stopped and dressed the man's wounds, took good care of him, took him to an inn, paid for his keep overnight so he could recuperate. Now, that's a story that Jesus created. And my father said, Tommy, did Jesus tell us about the Good Samaritan? Yes, sir. My father said, Jesus wouldn't lie. I said, no, but it was a story that Jesus created to make a point. My father never understood what I was trying to say. Well, the story that we're reading today about these two men on their way to Emmaus is a parable. Just as Jesus created parables, so did Luke, the writer of this gospel. It's a teaching story. Now, there is so much about this story that is so meaningful. The fact that these men had seen the crucifixion, but they didn't understand it. Now, that has been true throughout the world across the years. So this story symbolizes the fact that sometimes people know something about Jesus, but they don't really know Jesus. These men were walking with him, listening to him, and they didn't know it was Jesus. I've had friends who wanted me to tell them something more about Jesus and why I believe in Jesus, because they had heard about Jesus. They had gone to Sunday school maybe, but they still really didn't grasp the meaning of it all. So this is a story that illustrates the fact that people might know something about Jesus without really knowing him. There's another level of meaning here. It was when he took bread and broke it and blessed it. Then their eyes were open. Now, what does that say to us? It says, across the years, as people have sat down and broken bread and prayed over it, that act has been a revelation. The act of breaking the bread in Jesus' name is a revelation of his presence. So Luke is anticipating the fact that in the future, there will be a time when people, in breaking of bread and remembering Jesus, would see Jesus in that act. We call it a sacrament because it brings the very presence of God into our midst. So those are two meanings of this story. There's more, of course. After these two men understand that they were with Jesus, then they went back and talked to the disciples and gave witness of what they had experienced. And Luke wants us to know that's what Jesus wants all of us to do. That is, when we've been with Jesus, it's God's will that we go forward and tell others about our experience. So this story has levels of meaning beyond the details of the story itself. Now, some of you know that I love stories because I find stories are a compelling way. A good story excites our imagination. It's like when we didn't have television, but we had radio, and at home we could listen to the Home Ranger, for example, or some other story on the radio. And our imaginations were enlivened by the words that we were hearing. Well, stories have the power to do that, to enable us to have insight and understanding, sometimes beyond the words themselves. They give us a mental picture, a mental understanding. Now, Jesus became a great storyteller in his years as a teacher, preacher, prophet. And you think about Jesus' stories that continue to have power 20 centuries later. This story that Luke tells has continued to be remembered. Here we are now, 20 centuries later, talking about this story because it has meaning for us today. As I said, I love stories. Some of my stories are not parables, but they are stories of testimonies for me, stories of people that I have known whose lives have touched my life. Sometimes these stories have been so wonderful, some people have said to me, are you telling me exactly something happened? Because it seems you're a lucky guy. You meet a lot of wonderful people. Yes, that's true. 5 years before I was born, a baby boy was born in Iran, ancient Persia. He was born into one of the wealthiest families in Iran. During the Second World War, his father was the foreign minister of Iran. The family into which he was born was not a Muslim family, although most of the people in Iran were and are Muslims. However, this family, the Burhani family, were members of a sect called the Baha'i religion, Baha'i. The members, the devotees of Baha'i, consider their religion as the ultimate religion in the world. In view of the fact that its beliefs are drawn from the major religions, especially religions in the Near East, their beliefs are drawn from Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. But they will tell you, as far as they're concerned, the Baha'i religion has drawn these truths together in a way that enables Baha'i to function as the parent religion for the world's people. Baha'i has a number of highly educated people, intellectual people, who are also deeply devoted to their faith. It is assumed that every member of the Baha'i faith would share his or her faith with other people along the way. So wherever they would travel, they would tell people about this ultimate faith, so that ultimately people throughout the world will be blessed by folks who have understood these spiritual truths that enlightened Baha'i people have and want to share. Now that baby who was born 5 years ahead of me, turned out to be a very bright child. He was privileged to attend some of the finest schools in Iran that included some of the Presbyterian schools there. He learned about Jesus, at least something about Jesus. He was a diligent, serious student. His teachers considered him extremely bright. When he became old enough to go to college, he did, but then he came eventually to America because even as a young man, he was drawn to the study of medicine. And he came to America to consider his medical studies. He knew some of the great universities that have medical schools are among the best in the world. So he came to learn more about medicine. He was especially interested in cardiology. Not many years after he came to America, he met a young lady from the Midwest, a Baptist girl. But he really fell for her, and they got married. After a while, she saw the announcement that Billy Graham was going to be preaching here in New York City. By that time, this man, whose name was Naamat Ullah Burhani, he and Pat had moved to New York where he was continuing his studies. So Pat, having heard the announcement that Billy Graham was coming to New York, tried to twist his arm. She knew that he didn't have much interest, but she thought, knowing him as the pleasant person he was, she could coax him to go with her or take her to hear Billy Graham. He really didn't want to do that, but he loved her. And he said he would agree to take her to Madison Square Garden the first night. And he told me later, he knew that it would be so crowded, but he promised Pat that if he could find a parking place, he would go in with her. And if he couldn't find a parking place, he would leave her, she would be there, and then he would come back for her. As they drove up to Madison Square Garden, lo and behold, she said, "Naamat, look, a guy is pulling out. We can have that parking place." So Naamat drove in, and he told me he knew his goose was cooked. But he walked into that auditorium. This was a new experience for him, of course. But he sat down with Pat. He heard some testimonies, and then the music. Now, he had grown up in a privileged community and family, a wealthy family, and so he was familiar with classical music. This was new music for him, but he found it not unpleasant, so he listened, and then eventually, Billy Graham spoke up, stood up, spoke, started preaching. he preached a typical Billy Graham evangelistic sermon. And there sat a young doctor from Iran, a Baha'i, who had never heard anything really like that before. When Billy was finished, he gave the usual invitation, inviting people to come forward and receive Christ. Dr. Borhani looked full face into the face of his beloved young wife and said, "I wouldn't believe this happening to me, but it is. I've been really listening for something like this all my life." He got up and walked down, talked to a counselor. He came back. They drove home, and quietly he told Pat, "I received Christ. Now tell me what that means." And she did her best to help him understand what that meant. They went to a Baptist church in Manhattan and had some conferences with the pastor there, and a few weeks later, he was baptized. Then they moved to Baltimore because he wanted to continue his studies at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and he was offered a position as the director of one of the departments, hypertension department. Now, it happened at the time that he had come to America, had met Pat, moved to New York. I had completed my work in Wake Forest at the seminary, and I moved back home to Baltimore, where I became the associate pastor of the First Baptist Church, and I became a graduate student at Johns Hopkins University. Same year that Billy Graham went to New York. By the way, that was the beginning of Billy Graham's career. They had planned to have several nights at Madison Square Garden, but the nights continued week after week after week. And then finally, on the last night, they were meeting in another of they met in Yankee Stadium, filled. The New York Times said there were 100,000 people jammed into the stadium. And that was really where Billy Graham's ministry in America took off from there. Now, among the hundreds and thousands of people who attended those Billy Graham meetings was a young doctor from Iran who said he received Christ, and then he learned from his wife what that meant. They moved to Baltimore so that he could become the head of the hypertension department at Hopkins. One Sunday, I was standing in the pulpit at First Baptist Church, and a couple came down the aisle, as Baptists do. They came down the aisle. I thought, is that the Shah of Iran? That's what he looks like. Small, wavy hair, black hair. His wife, fairly tall American girl, blonde. Quite a couple. I walked down and met them at the front. He introduced himself. I'm Namit Borhani. I'm a doctor at Hopkins, and this is my wife, Pat. and we want to join this church. How do we do that? I said, sit down right now, and I'll tell the folks. So I introduced them to the congregation, and I said, I don't know anything about this couple, but clearly they want to join here, and I know that we're happy to welcome them, aren't we? Well, of course, at the end of the service, after the benediction, people crowded around. Now, that was the beginning of a personal relationship between my wife and me and that couple. And that man who had just learned what it means to receive Christ became a source of new energy and vitality in an old church. Most of our members were older people, but their lives were touched deeply by this young enthusiast. The same energy and commitment that he had experienced as a member of the Baha'i faith, lo and behold, he brought that into his life as a Christian, and he renewed that old church. He was so bright and so respected by his peers that he ended up in California as one of the most respected cardiologists in the world. He headed a presidential commission on heart, cancer, and stroke, for example, a blue ribbon commission that gave him status throughout the world. But through the years, he continued teaching at University of California, Davis campus. Eventually, he and Pat moved over to Tahoe. Well, they were members of a little Baptist church there, whose pastor I knew, and who told me that that couple had transformed the whole community because of their excitement and enthusiasm for the Lord. I was a trustee of a seminary in California one year, and I went out there, my wife and I together, for a meeting, but also to visit Naaman and Pat. He had just died from leukemia at 70. And of course, my wife and I drove up from San Francisco up to Tahoe to meet her and to visit with her at the place where he was buried. We knelt down. We knelt down and thanked the Lord for bringing this man into our lives and in the lives of hundreds of people, and bringing a blessing of spiritual renewal and excitement for the Lord wherever they went. Now, his family back in Iran was not happy because, as I said, the Baha'is are very devout people. So they treated him as if he had died. They had a mock funeral for him back there. This was when he was still living. They cut him off from any family inheritance, for example. Now and then people would say, Dr. Borhani, I know what has happened in your life, and that was quite a loss. Family, inheritance. And my kidding, he would say, oh, as the song says, I'd rather have Jesus.